unless there's something that really bugs me and really stands out to me or is completely wrong from what I had envisioned in the script originally, I'll just plow through and like, actually, let's see your vision all the way through. The reason why if it's the penciler or the inker or the color artist or whoever, sometimes even the letterer, where it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting something like this, but you know what? Like, run with it. And some of those have been the best results that I've ever gotten, versus the ones that annoy me the most are the ones that I absolutely micromanaged and I nitpicked and I was like, I don't like the way that this energy field looks. Can we maybe make it look less digital and maybe increase, the contrast a little bit and maybe change it from bluish purple to like greenish blue, like all those tiny minutia. None of those in retrospect was ever like, oh, thank God, I nitpicked the hell out of that panel. That really made this one shine.
Welcome back to Inspired Inc., the Comics Wellspring podcast, a show where we promote indie comic creators and become inspired by what they create and their journey of creating it. I'm your host, Brandon Bloxdorf, and today on the show, we have publisher Paranoid American joining us, and we talk about how controversial comics can sometimes be the most inspiring and educational, and why you should be creating the comics that you want to read, along with how to let go of the creative reins and let the mistakes happen. All this and so much more on today's Inspired Inc.
I don't know if there's really any secrets to be had, honestly, unless you've got like a dungeon of artists and writers that are just like exclusive, that are working for table scraps or something. But I don't think there's necessarily secrets, although you just touched on one thing that I don't know if I would say it's a sore spot, but it's like for me, it's one of the more challenging aspects of this entire industry is exactly what you just mentioned, that comic conventions, because comic conventions is the one place where you can remove a lot of the barriers to entrance to get into, more of like a general exposure, because you got people that are sometimes flying in from all over the country, maybe even the world, even for like a little tiny comic convention, for what you might think it is. But that's the one chance where you don't have to go through Lunar or Diamond or do cold calling and like hit the streets and maybe cover like 30 or 40 cities if you're lucky in like a local area or even in your state. And then when you do it at a convention, it just invites everybody in. So it's one of these really important linchpins, but it's also such a gamble, and it's not, in my experience, friendly at all to independent publishers. Maybe if you're a standalone writer or standalone artist in particular, then it's really easy. But the second where you're like, well, I've got more than just one book, I've got 10, and maybe I've got, some collaborations with other people too. Now, all of a sudden, the barrier to entry is like 5 times the cost, and it turns into an entirely different discussion for publishers versus artists.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think I'm going to be running into a lot of those roadblocks kind of this coming year or so. I mean, Apollo City Comics has, we turned into a publishing imprint this year. And with that, like our schedule for this coming year is pretty big. We have a couple, creator-owned books that it's not run by me yet. It's run by, like, we have Adam Matthew Smith and all these other people putting out books. We have more anthologies than ever. And it's not like I'm not just promoting Apollo City Comics, my podcast, and like my comic Teenage Babylon and stuff. It's like everything, trying to put this all together and promote it at one table. So it's kind of like what you're saying, that scatterbot, where you're just like, you're putting so much more out there as a publisher than you are if I was just doing Teenage Babylon. That would be cool. You know what I mean? It would be really fun because it's just one singular focus. But people like, us, we have 1,000 things that we're putting out, and we have all these, creations, and publishing, and especially, is way different than just being a single creator. And Paranoid Americans worked on a lot of stuff like that, the last few years. What made you want to like actually just be like call it as publisher at that point?
I couldn't find anyone that would publish anything that I was making, let alone take it seriously. Like that extra part was the one that was like the true motivator, because at a certain point it just felt like, oh, there might actually not be any space that anyone's offering right now for these kinds of stories. And it was like, either you do it or it just maybe won't exist. And I found a few little independent, self-published books out there, which is exactly how I started. I
Mhm.
just never stopped at one or two or three or 10. And then before I knew it, it was like, now I'm the guy, I guess.
How big is the catalog for you now?
So published, it's just over 20. We're creeping into 30 books, but unpublished, meaning I've got lots of books that are more or less done. Like I could start releasing them digitally right now, but I really want to have the opportunity to announce them and promote them and get them in print and make sure that there's like a true release of it, and I don't just like dump a whole bunch of stuff onto the market and then hope they just kind of naturally succeed. Sometimes it doesn't happen that way in my years of experience now. So if we consider all the unpublished, I'm closer to 60. Like for example,
Oh
I've
my
got,
gosh.
I mean, I just printed maybe 6 or 7 titles with Comix Wellspring in the last month or two that haven't been released at all yet. So I've got the
Ooh.
inventory built up. So when I actually start running some campaigns, hopefully it recoups some of the printing cost for all of that. But it'll allow me to deliver exactly on time, no hiccups, no unknown variables, and that's been really important to me. So the long answer is about 60 titles and growing pretty much every month.
That's insane. And you're going about this handling indie creators, and it's so great because like, we kind of just discovering each other, because of this podcast. It's I run a small publishing imprint, you're running a publishing imprint, and like now we're like coming together where we could kind of like help and like I know of course I'm gonna promote your stuff and like, repost a lot of your work and everything. But it's wild because so many of your creators I have not discovered yet, and probably vice versa for you. The creators we're putting out, I don't think you've probably discovered half of the people we're putting out, and it's going to be a cool influx of just like new creations and new art coming, into the comic book universe. What drove you to be like, I want to choose this criteria for this, besides, it didn't fit anywhere else, but like you're continuing to bring in so many books that it's now a wider audience. How have you widened what Paranoid American is and to bring in all these inclusive creators?
Well, it started almost as like a necessity because I don't know for any other comic creators or even writers out there, anyone that starts on a creative endeavor in a new space for the first time, and you finally put together your first whatever work it is. Maybe it's an album, maybe it's a novella, whatever, fill in the blank. But at least for me, I realized pretty quickly as I try to keep extending that, and this was the series Time Samplers.
Oh,
So
cool.
I quickly realized as I was plotting out, what the next 6 or 7 issues might entail, there was just a lot going on, and I refer to it now as like my kitchen sink comic, in that every idea that I had built up over 10 plus years, maybe like 2 plus decades, like every little quirky idea or little point that I wanted to make and reference that I wanted to make, I was just intent on like cramming it all into this one series, to where there was just so much going on, and I kind of sat back and I realized at one point that I was going to have to make a decision, like do I want it to go down this angle, and in this case it was, do I want it to have more of like a philosophical, psychedelic, like inner seeking kind of approach? Or do I want to go more into like a historical fiction, time travel, action fighting approach? And I could do both, absolutely. But with
Yeah.
a budget of trying to create and do everything on my own, like time and money and everything is a finite
Yes.
resource. So at that point, I realized, like, okay, I'm just gonna make time samplers be completely about like deep research, like all documented research, and cite names and dates and places, but lean completely into, say, the historical fiction aspect of it and like the adventure and action aspect. And then it spawned, what is this one? Yeah, it spawned this one, which is Secret Mystery School. And Secret Mystery School, if you take a read through it, it's like this takes all of that mystery and like psychedelic philosophy angle, and it just lets it focus in that title. And it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made, because it allowed me to clear up and focus not just time samplers, but then Secret Mystery School. So then I kind of went back to the well, and I was like, what else is time samplers trying to do that maybe it's not getting through like the best way that it could be? And in the same vein, like refocus it and make it better and better. So that's kind of where some of them started to branch out. I had another one called Black Mass Pizza, which is
Mm.
co-written or actually mainly written by Doc Wyatt, who does like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Lego Ninjago, and like just his credentials are overwhelming when you look
Hmm.
at it. And that was another example of like, okay, I want to take this like dark, nefarious, goofy aspect out and maybe have that be the focus of its own comic. So repeat that process 5 or 6 times, and then new ideas come up, and then I'm a lot better when a new idea comes up. I'll realize, is that one idea, is it two ideas, should I shorten it,
Mm.
should I like micro focus it on a certain thing? So that's where they all come from, and that's why they haven't stopped.
That is something I've come across myself as a creator, and I see that all too often with a lot of indie created books where it's very ambitious at first and you're trying to do a whole lot with just one thing. And I think it's because a lot of us have that feeling of like, this is my only chance. I should give it my all now, because if I don't give it my all now, I may never get to do this again. But once you start doing it, and you produce a piece of work, you realize, oh, I can do this, I can do this again. It's kind of like, I don't, like working out, for example. Like, it feels impossible your first time, like you're winded, it kicks your ass, like you just like want to catch your breath, and you're like, I don't ever want to come back to this place again. But then you're like, but I did it and it felt pretty good, let me try this one more time. And then you realize that it is possible and you can keep going. And I think once you realize that, like, once you do it once, you're going to get better at it every single time. And by doing it repeatedly, learning the ins and outs and learning from your lessons and streamlining processes, you could really like actually, like, all these thousands of ideas that you crammed into this one, like you said, you could spread it out and actually have a plethora of, stories and titles and, situations and characters that didn't exist before. But now it feels feasible. And now you're just like, okay, if I take my time and just tell it right and well, that's better than cramming it all into one thing. And I think a lot of people just kind of lose focus of that, is that it does take time and it does take a lot of patience, but you can really like build your story up as you want. And I love being able to like get more out of like less, in a sense, like I'd rather have like one streamlined idea story that is like, that was a solid, beautiful story as a whole, rather than like, this has had like seven different things into it. And if you're making a whole universe, that's super cool. But sometimes that branches out too hard. And then you get like kind of what DC's turned into, where there's just like, oh, I have 1,000 titles for this one character. And because it was one singular idea at one point, and now it's just everywhere.
Yeah, I kind of like that chaos now because it just means there's lots of cool little threads you can jump after. But that's exactly what it was too. Where I thought the first book, it was like, this might be the only one. Let's just
Hmm.
put every single thing that I've got going on in it. And I even considered, like, now, 10, I think I came out with Time Samplers #1 in 2012. And I even consider like going back and like maybe updating it or editing it. But also, I'm a very strong believer in don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and just
Hmm.
like just crank it out, get it done. If there's something that really truly bugs you and you'll never be able to let it down, go ahead and change that. But if you find yourself obsessing about that on like every other panel or every other page, then it might be you and not the book sometimes. And it's the same with every other creative endeavor too, where you, like, the creator just stares right at the blemish the entire time and ignores everything else.
Yep.
And sometimes, and I even hate to say this part of it, but it's just a very real aspect of comics, there's some people that just like fly through these pages anyways and aren't like analyzing every little panel in detail. um
Hmm.
if you're trying to cater to the crowd that analyze every detail, if that's what you do, then spend way more time on the artwork, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
if it's a matter of trying to get a story out of your head or conveying something in a medium and you already know what all the beats are, like, I tend to just make it so that it's enjoyable, make it so that it's, you're happy with it, and don't obsess over the little tiny bits of that. And part of that goes into, don't try to cram every idea you ever had and think that this is like your one shot ever.
I think, kind of letting go of the reins sometimes, and this calls for like just even with like yourself as like an editor and a creator, but just like letting those mistakes fly and happen. Not everything, letting go of perfection. Once you really get to embrace that concept, I feel like your artwork and your creativity really just skyrockets, because when you do focus on those micro little pieces, it almost seems like it'll never come out because you're just going to keep on finding stuff to edit, and you're going to keep on finding imperfections or the wrong line that you wrote or something. And sometimes you just got to push it out and keep on going because it's like you don't need to fix everything. Like what you're saying, a lot of, we spend months, sometimes years on these books, especially creator owned books like what we do. We all get off of a lot of us get off of our day job, and then we have to work on comics,
Right.
so you do your 40, 50 hours a week, and then you do another 40 hours on your book or whatever. And if you focus too much on that imperfection, you're just going to halt yourself. And nobody's looking for perfection here. Nobody's trying to be Jim Lee and Tony Daniel and all this type of stuff that seems like perfection, air quotes for those that listening to us on the audio. And once you realize that with indie comics, like it's here to have fun and to just do our best and show our unique styles, that's going to get you farther ahead than analyzing every single brick in the road, because not every brick of the road matters, to be honest.
There's another aspect you said, like Jim Lee. That's a very hard to obtain level of detail and everything, because he's a machine. Like Todd McFarlane. Like I'm not gonna just start listing names. Although there's one thing that came up, and I reflect on this a lot. But if I go back through and I look at my favorite artists growing up in comic books, and I'm not gonna drop any names or titles, because the other part of this I want to say is that almost every one of my favorite artists was like a very difficult person to work with, and I would go and look up and be like, how come so and so didn't do more of this? Like, this was my favorite ever. And then you go and read, and it's like, oh, no one liked to work with them, or they just they obsessed over stuff, or they didn't deliver on time, or all of these things that you never in a million years consider that kind of stuff as, at least for me as a kid, grabbing it and reading it and obsessing over it and going back to see the next one. You just wonder, like, why did this thing end? Like, why isn't this still going on? Why isn't so and so drawing Wolverine and Superman or whatever? So, and this even goes back into like the 70s. I've got like a lot of like kind of like cult classic favorites, and it was like, how come this guy never did like a huge run in Marvel or DC? Oh, okay, because they had a heroin addiction, or they were just never showered, or got into fist fights in the editor's room. Like all these are real references, by the way.
I think I recognize a couple of them too. I've been diving into a lot of like Comics Journal magazine lately, just trying to get better at interviewing and stuff like that, and trying to find comic related questions. And the wild stories you find in some of those interviews and what creators did, you're just like, whoa, I had no clue. Like, I wouldn't have ever assumed that before.
And now you're like, okay, maybe that's why there wasn't a huge run of like a big story arc or 4 or 5 of them. Because they were wild cards. And now you can extrapolate that again to like all my favorite musicians, all my favorite everythings seem to always be the wild cards. So there's also, unless we're talking about unicorns out there, shout out Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane, or all of the similar ones. But outside of that, there's like a huge middle ground where there's like reliable and predictable and not mediocre, but like acceptable, right? It gets the job done. But then there's sometimes like I'll work with a particular artist or writer, and it's like, lightning in a bottle. And sometimes you just can't keep the damn lightning in the bottle as much as you really want to. But that's all leading back to that whole perfectionist thing. If you're in that workflow of like, oh, I like it, but let's maybe change this pose and change this posture. So I've completely gone to maybe the other end of the extreme end of the spectrum, where it's like, unless there's something that really bugs me and really stands out to me, or is completely wrong from what I had envisioned in the script originally, I'll just plow through and like, actually, let's see your vision all the way through. The reason why if it's the penciler or the inker or the color artist or whoever, sometimes even the letterer, where it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting something like this, but you know what? Like, run with it. And some of those have been the best results that I've ever gotten, versus the ones that annoy me the most are the ones that I absolutely micromanaged and I nitpicked, and I was like, I don't like the way that this energy field looks. Can we maybe make it look less digital, and maybe increase, the contrast a little bit, and maybe change it from bluish purple to like greenish blue? Like all those tiny minutia, none of those in retrospect was ever like, oh, thank God, I nitpicked the hell out of that panel. That really made this one shine. Whereas sometimes I'll sit back and
crowdfunding succeeded. That one panel that I worked on for 3 days to edit, like.
And you know that, and it might mean something to you, but it really won't mean a whole lot to other people. And in fact, it'll probably make that one stand out in a bad way because now it's like overworked compared. So, anyways, the long story of that one
Good
is
point there
I've
too. Yeah.
learned to just like let go of the reins sometimes. It doesn't always work, but also in retrospect, maybe it never would have worked. So like, don't beat yourself up over that because, you know, there's been artists that I worked with and I find out years later, or writers or whoever, and it's like, oh wow, they were going through something major.
Hmm.
And you know, that's why this project never would have happened or never would have maybe been perfect. But I've also learned that sometimes those weird life events happen like right after a project wraps. And I sit back and I'm like, thank God I didn't nitpick page 4 or 5 on those like little, because then I would have had, you know, like 14 pages of a 20-page story. And that is the absolute worst situation that I've ever found myself in, is when you're like, yeah, 14 to 16 pages into a comic and then something happens and what do you do? You know, there's
Yeah.
only so many options.
And we're not at the level where we could be like, oh, we could easily replace this artist with a similar artist that can draw in their style. We don't have like a selection of people like that. So when that happens in indie comics, it's like detrimental to the book itself. And it's really hard to adapt and overcome at that point. You know, changing artists issue to one issue is one thing, but mid issue, that gets really difficult. And that gets really difficult to navigate, especially if you're crowdfunding and figuring out how to, you know, compensate your artists or compensate the creators or whatever deal you have worked out with them. That can just throw a wrench into your whole project, and it changes the tone of everything because so much of indie comics is about appearance more than story. As cool as and great as so many of these writers are, and even myself included, I think I'm pretty okay writer overall. Like, what's going to sell my book is like, you know, my artist's art, and that's what's going to get people's attention. So that's a heavy blow. And that's how did you navigate through that situation if that happened to you actually?
Well, so actually, I understand what you're saying, and I'm also realizing that I approached it from a completely different angle, which wasn't my intent, but it was very evident almost like day one. And that was that quickly I found out that the broad majority, and I'll just make up some arbitrary numbers, but like we're talking 90% plus of my audience were people that hadn't read comics since they were much younger and had kind of abandoned the medium or just had no interest in it, and then found the content and the topics that I write about. And then that was like, oh, I've never seen this presented as a comic book before. And then that became the entry point. And I kind of built my main audience off that specific type of reader, someone that was like, oh, because like the name Paranoid American, I pretty much cover like conspiracy theories. And the very first issue of Time Samplers, for example, it talks about the founding of the Federal Reserve and Jekyll Island and J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers, and it's fairly dull content normally. Like if you were to actually try and figure this stuff out, it's you know, it's very cut and dry. It's old dudes meeting in rooms talking about handwritten spreadsheets and stuff, and you know, exchanging money. It's not necessarily, no one had guns, there weren't explosions, but I add that part to it. So I retell for in Time Samplers 1 like the actual beats of these guys meeting in clandestine in Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of South Georgia, and they plan this Federal Reserve in 1913, and it becomes a thing. But in the midst of that, there's also a naked Alexander Graham Bell who is breeding human with sheeple to make like the ultimate servant. So he has like literal sheeple, and our guys time travel back to 1913, and they have to fight the sheeple off, and then they have to fight a naked Alexander Graham Bell. But all of this in the background, it's like teaching you about the names and dates and people and the connections between them. There's some connections between the members in there and like the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, and that's what issue 2 gets into. So you can kind of see like I start tying that little thread. So I get a lot of people that were interested in the Federal Reserve or interested in Skull and Bones or interested in particular way before Stranger Things came out, Project Monarch and Project Montauk and Camp Hero, which is all like that was the original name for Stranger Things, I think, was Project Montauk.
Yeah.
So I mean I would have people that were like, I've never seen this research presented. And on top of that, it's very dark content, but I find a way, I hopefully, to make it sort of not, it's not horror, it's not dark, it doesn't like leave a weird, taste in your mouth, but it
It's
still
fun.
addresses all of the stuff. It's fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
I make it fun somehow. I don't know how.
Dude, it's looking at the previews you sent, and you sent me a couple issues as well to like preview before this podcast. I was looking over them right now, and they were actually the last week. They're what's so great is like how much fun I had by page 2, and how like invested I was by the time I was just like, okay, let's get it's an indie book, let's be open, let's check it out. And I'm looking through it, and I'm like, dude, this is insane. Like this is the coolest like concept of all these fun, the Sasquatch character and like the Mothman character coming together. Yeah, all these cool little American tidbits that are, it reminds me a lot of like Fallout, like the video game and
Hmm.
everything, and how they do historical things and with a twist. And or there was a show back in the day called Time Squad on Cartoon Network, and it reminded me of even that, where I love watching stuff or playing or anything like that, where it's very historically accurate and you're getting real information, but you're making it entertaining. And not enough, we don't get enough of that anymore. I feel like I learned so much from older cartoons and things like that and certain books, because it was like you got to make something fun and you got to teach somebody something. If it's a lesson, if it's a history, a historical thing, if you're able to weave these things together, then it doesn't sound preachy, like you're forcing an educational thing on them. It doesn't sound like preachy in the sense of you're just like trying to hammer down like something that they just need to know message wise or thematically. It's like we're having a blast right now, and coincidentally all this is accurate, and that's
Yeah.
the coolest way you could do that.
That, I mean, that was the main goal, was the original tagline, which isn't the same now, but it was truth really is stranger than fiction. But that's kind of like the ultimate pillar in the back of my mind of everything that I do. And it's to make something that seems so outlandish that even though there's like an actual sheeple hybrid that's karate chopping someone in the background, but that's not even the crazy part. The craziest part is like, wait, are you saying that they were like smelting gold in like this chamber inside the Titanic, and that's what maybe weakened the hull, and that there was all this other plotting going on? That's just like the most outlandish part. And if you look into that, you're like, oh, there's actually a lot to this, and I don't make any claims as to like having the ultimate authority on any of these truths. In fact, my best effort, and is sometimes the hardest one, is to sit back and say, who has strong opinions on whatever topic I'm getting into. So if it's the Titanic or whatever, and I try to address though, like I've got a children's book called "Connect the Dots: The Confounding Conspiracy of Chemtrails." So right off the bat, and it's very controversial in some ways. I'm surprised that it
I
hasn't
love
got
it.
taken off Amazon yet, but so. And I go into it, and this one in particular is like, I know that there's already going to be eye rolling, and someone that's like, oh, come on, please, what is this Alex Jones garbage? Get it out of here. So there's a character that is made specifically to always bring up the official story in a non-ironic, non-condescending way, but just like, oh, this is all the facts. And then there's always the character that is like off the deep end and thinks it's always reptilians. But then you've got all these other characters, and it's definitely inspired by Magic School Bus in some ways.
Oh, I
Just
love it.
they research conspiracy theories instead of biology.
That's brilliant too. And again, we talked about it a few times on the show, but bringing in influences and kind of doing your own twist on it, because you kind of don't put those pieces together like as a fan, but like you being able to drop influences that like, oh, this is what I'm comparing it to for you to get into it. I think a lot of creators got to learn that kind of back and forth. Be like, if you like X, Y, and Z, you're gonna dig this. And it's not so much to be like not to compare it to, but to find similar tastes. I feel like when some people discourage themselves from comparing it to other influences or naming influences or what it's similar to, because they feel like, oh, they're going to realize I stole X, Y, and Z from this, or it's too similar to that, and they think I'm just doing my version of that, when it's like, no, this is all your influences channeled and funneled through me into this scenario. Kind of like when you make a character, every character is a person, and when it's like making a character being like, oh, it's another person, it's like, no, it's this specific person in this scenario. That's what makes it so unique and different. And as an indie creator, with as much work as you have and as many characters as you've pretty much created at this point, just looking at a lot of this work that you've co-written or been co-creator of or creator of, it's like that's the formula. Just keep spitting out these ideas and putting them in these scenarios and having as much fun as possible. Because if you're having as much fun as you are right now, like you've been doing this for I think 10 plus years.
I mean, officially 2012, but I was legitimately started on the story for time samplers in 2006. And before that, the concept of time samplers was going to be like a music group. So it was like a slow thing that morphed and mutated into its current form over 2 decades plus.
I love it. What drove you to want to tell these stories in a comic book medium over anything else?
So I had music placed on Adult Swim in the early 2000s. So if you watched
rad.
like all the little bumpers between the shows and they would play
Yes.
the little, so I had a lot, like a large portion of my library got scooped up by Turner, William Street slash, Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, and they
That is
were
cool.
playing that. And it was just the coolest thing because I would have people, call, or I would be out like at a friend's house, and like if they had Adult Swim in the background, and the music would come on, and what's the meme? Like nobody knows that this is my song, and they're all like dancing. It wasn't quite like that, but it would be like, this is someone, my name time was sound scientist. Like, oh, this is the God scientist. This is music. So I started getting really interested in like, man, I would love to like also have my cartoon con right after that. And I was sort of self-taught with Photoshop, and I found Adobe After Effects, and it was basically Photoshop but video, and you could do all this. And this is again like late 90s to early 2000s. I think it might have still been. Anyways, it started there, and I really wanted it to be animated series because it was like a music concept, and then the Gorillas were out, and I was like, man, Gorillas, but conspiracy theorists, and they're singing and rapping about mind control or whatever, filling the. I'll try to be a little bit tame here. But and it started as that, and then it actually got far enough to where I had some connections because another coincidence, I worked at Disney for about 10 years, and a few years into this, I started tapping everyone that I worked with and new people, and I got meetings with like the old producers and animators from like Klasky Supo, which is like Rugrats and Doug and all of this. And a whole bunch of like Film Roman, which is Simpsons, a bunch of different people, and I got to sit down and like scrape their brains for info. I even got to pitch this to a few Titmouse and 6 Point Harness. These are all like really big animation studios. Now I was way underprepared, and I'll just really quick. I went in, like someone asked me, the 2 characters, like who's their mom? And I freaking choked, and I realized I had never even considered that, maybe they've got parents or something, because we're just these. So anyways, after that experience, and I actually got to talk with the real people that could have made it, onto Adult Swim. Like it was the people, but I also got the budget for something like that at that level of production. And like I did more than blush at it. It was like at the time, the bare minimum quotes we were getting was like $70,000 for maybe a 7 to 11 minute pilot max, like all inclusive. And we had like some writers attached to it, because that's also a big thing, is if you want to pitch it, like you gotta have names. So anyways, we tried earnestly for a year or two and try to get investors and try to get people that would, put money up for the $70,000 pilot about conspiracy theories that might not even be acceptable for advertisers anywhere. And it went about as well as you can imagine. There was one chance, but we were either going to have to water it down so much, or we'd have to take on this one investor that was like gung-ho about a very controversial topic that I did not agree on. And they were basically trying to turn it into like a political vehicle for some like motive that they had. So I said, okay, I don't have $7,000. I don't even have 700 at this point. Probably didn't even have 100, but 70,000 was way out of the question. And I just kind of naturally thought backwards and figured, well, I'm going to have to start out with the storyboards anyways. So if I were to do the storyboards, but a little bit better, and maybe like make animatics out of them, like maybe if I started with a comic and then had all the panels, this is kind of like the organic thinking process and all the concept art, then I could reuse all those assets and use that to make like an animated comic. And then maybe that could be the gateway to the full animation production experience. So that was the foray. But once I made that first issue, I was like, oh, this is way cooler than animation. Like, it might not come with all of the same accolades of, you know, my thing's on TV, or, you know, you can go and watch my thing, but I love the freedom and the flexibility, especially of looking at a splash page and just thinking, even if I animated this, like, this is $5,000 that I'm looking at to animate at the baseline, or I can come up with all these crazy ideas and just find a page rate that I can afford and do it that way. And it unlocks something, a new scratch that I haven't been able to itch yet.
Has that like, did that kind of really motivate and like keep you going with comics? Like, as you continue to make so many, just looking back and being like, well, if I don't make this, like, it would never be made. And if you would have gone down another route, you would have had maybe 1 or 2 ideas done, I would say, by now, maybe 3 if you're really fortunate, like series wise, instead of like everything you have now. Like, does that really keep you like 100% going and, you know, motivated?
Yeah, I really do believe in maybe like maybe a narcissistic way, but like, I really do feel that no one else is gonna publish these kinds of stories. Like, I've got some that are queued up that I need to wait until I grow a little bit more to really sink my teeth into, but I've got like a 6-issue series, limited series planned out, all about the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh. But to bring kind of this, you know, the dick joke flair of Paranoid American into it in a way, and have a completely new approach. But like, that's one of those things that I just can't imagine any other publisher. And it's not that, you know, oh, they're too afraid. It's just that it doesn't sell necessarily. Another one that I've been working on for maybe going on 4 or 5 years now. And now I'm gonna have to raise money to get it colored, but it's like the inks are done, the story's done, like everything's done except the colors. It's about Lee Harvey Oswald that is fighting demons because he's trained from a young age to like basically be able to jump between like the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And the story ultimately culminates where he's kind of this unsung hero that is saving JFK from a demonic possession. But like, and again, it's one of those things that I'm sure someone could do it, but no one else is going to do this in my lifetime. So I feel like I have to do it.
Dude, I love that. I think that is the coolest thing. That's the coolest idea I've heard in a while. I'm not going to lie.
Some people are not fans of it, by the way. I get lots of...
Oh man, that got me cracking up. So I guess, I mean, I grew up with that Adult Swim like humor. I grew up with a lot of stuff that you're dropping like is stuff I'm into. And then like, I'm super into like kind of these conspiracy theories. I'm a big Blink-182 fan, so I'm a big Tom DeLonge person.
Okay.
And
the
everything
UFO
is
disclosure.
Yeah, and all UFO stuff and his Sasquatch obsession and things like that. And so like all of this like resonates with points that I just love and admire. And I can't wait to really dive into like your, you know, body of work. You know, just checking out the little bit I've seen is super exciting and fun. But it seems like you got like the Cartoon Network feel with like all these, you know, that wackiness from classic Cartoon Network. You know what I mean? Like from that 90s era, early 2000s era, that's just, I feel like non-existent anymore. But you've brought it to a mature audience. And I think that's everything that a lot of people, like probably like my and our age, kind of want, is to have that fun, but still get something that's kind of adult and, you know, kind of accurate in a sense. I think that's super cool. And you're right. I think that's a big reason why we do start our own publishing imprints, is because I didn't see anyone publishing the books I was going to make or what I planned to make. And you kind of just gotta, it's that punk rock attitude. You just got to get up and do it yourself. And, you know, fine, I'll do it myself type of thing, you know, because if you do it that way, you're really just like testing yourself on how badly you want to make art and comics too. Because if you really want this to happen, you're going to make it happen. If you want to make movies and TV shows and animation and all that stuff, that's very possible. And I encourage everyone to follow the dreams and do what they can. But I feel like it's so hard and so difficult. And, you know, a previous episode, we were talking about gatekeepers and how like you can make art for gatekeepers, or you can make art for yourself. And that's going to be like your own creation that you want to have fun with. And whichever route you go for, as long as you're happy doing it, go for it. But I feel like a lot of us are just like really backing away from that gatekeeper writing to being like, I just want to be happy and do what I want. The world's hard and rough enough. Why do I got to appeal to my day job and then go to try to appeal to this audience as well? When what about me? You know, what about like what I want to do in life?
Well, and yet part of this too feels like an obsession, like something that you got to get out.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, for me, the conspiracy theory angle, like I knew that some of my thoughts, if I try to just sit down and explain it to anybody, like I'd lose friends and family members maybe. But if I could do it again with like a big naked Alexander Graham Bell and like, sheeple that are obviously, cartoonish and over the top caricatures, then like my story makes more sense and I can actually portray it in like the way that I actually think about it. And like, this is like maybe a bad example, but it was a huge inspiration for me. Is there was this freaking interview between Tucker Carlson and Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, and this was back when Tucker, I think, was on like CNN, MSNBC, or something, and he used to wear a little bow tie, and they were trying to grill Jon Stewart on some opinion that he had, which like some a flippant political opinion.
Yeah.
And when they thought they had him in like a gotcha moment, Jon Stewart just kind of threw it back at him, and he was like, "Dude, the show that comes after me are puppets making prank phone calls." And like you're here grilling me over this, and it was sort of like a nail in the coffin. I don't think Tucker ever wore that bow tie ever again after that. But it raised this cheat code. It was like this freaking Game Genie Konami code where it was like, oh, so you can say really controversial political things, but if you do it and you say it was an obvious joke, or that like, look, you can't take this seriously. Like nobody looks good criticizing a comedian, right? Like maybe if you're in a small room and everybody feels the same way, but in general, it's people tend to give artists and musicians and comedians kind of this like pass as long as there's merit to the creative endeavor itself, because if it's just like some crappy endeavor and it's just a vehicle that's blatantly to push some message, but if there's a message but it's also paired with like merit, like creative merit, then it makes it very hard to criticize that without you seeming like you're just out of touch or you're just like a cranky bumpkin, right? Like some rube that can't take the joke. So that was like a light bulb going off where I was like, this is maybe even better than music, because music could also maybe just feel way too political or way too specific because it lacks so much of the extra context where you don't know what they're thinking. So when it's like cartoony and you can decide on a color palette, you can decide on the pacing, how much attention to give certain things and real estate and all of that. Again, it's I'm just gonna geek off about like how incredible the comic medium is compared to almost any other medium, but this was just like a really perfect way of getting those kinds of ideas across.
Dude, that's such a good way to put it too. Do you run into a lot of like issues, or like do you think people get turned off by even like, a paranoid American, the way the landscape has changed over the last couple of years with like just how crazy the political world is? Have you run into roadblocks, and like, what obstacles have you kind of like bumped into there and overcome?
Big time. So 2012, that was when I released the first issue of Time Stamp. And again, this goes back before, the early 2000s. But 2012, I break out onto the scene. I've got Paranoid American as a company and a brand. And the biggest thing at that point was basically Occupy Wall Street was sort of around that era.
Yeah.
And if you were talking about conspiracy theories, might have been a lot of like 9/11 conspiracy theories, a lot of like big banker type stuff. But it didn't necessarily feel like conspiracy theories were owned by left or right or any particular, political party.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are just distrustful in general of Wall Street. So it was a very non-secular, bipartisan, across the aisle, yes, conspiracies are going on, everyone's in on it kind of a deal, right? So add 10 years to that in 2022. Now, when you say I'm a conspiracy theorist, all of a sudden it's got this like really strong political lean to it. And now people might assume that you're like, left wing, right wing, or that you support this crazy person because they're also a conspiracy theorist and they said something crazy about schools or something on the TV. And oh, so you're one of that. And it's so charged now that, it's in some ways, it was almost like I bought in real early in the early days of like Bitcoin conspiracy money, right? Like I've invested, I've got all the research, I've got all the materials, and now everyone's into it. But there's also a lot of baggage that comes with some of it. But I mean, I've seen it all coming, and I really do feel like one of those annoyingly sort of like balanced centrists in a lot of ways, like where I've discovered that I'm definitely not the biggest conspiracy theorist in the room anymore in the company that I keep now. Like now I'm probably the one that's like, I don't know, I still believe in dinosaurs, guys. Like I don't know if I believe in flat earth. And like I'll get stink eye from that crowd. But it's been an interesting journey, and there's lots of roadblocks. There's a lot of people, that artists and writers I've worked with, and they were like, ooh, that one thing that you just, said you were working on, like I can't be associated with that. Sorry. I'm out, we're out of this project, or this will be the last one. That's happened many, many times. A lot of roadblocks trying to promote. Sometimes social media in itself, like I'll just publish the cover of a comic that I'm working on, and it's like, I get shadow banned because it has a naughty word on the cover. And I'm not talking about profanity, but like a persona non grata type of phrase that I won't even mention to just be respectful of your show, but it would get it demonetized. I'll just say that.
There you go, dude. That's wild. I was thinking about that too. I was wondering how that would impact you so much, but it's good that like through all of that you're still doing it, and through any of these little hiccups and like these naysayers and this like different you bring out a whole different group of people than most comic book people bring out, like it's an entire section.
You're welcome, world.
Honestly, thank you for that. But it's like you're still gonna keep doing you, and that's what's important. And you're going to continue doing your art. You're going to continue making these stories. You're not going to care about what these people are saying or thinking. And I love that. I admire that, because that takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of balls and a lot of like grit, just to be like, it doesn't matter. This is what I love and this is what I want. And I'm going to do this no matter what. And you don't need approval from anyone to do what you're doing. And you're not going to accept or, deny approval of what you want and what you're doing. And that's really admirable, because a lot of people will stop at a certain point and just kind of cover themselves up, or, maybe try to change themselves or falsify themselves because of lashback like that. And to keep going through all that and still deal with day life, that's admirable. Like that's extra work you're taking on no matter what. And it's something you got to do to put your art out there, and your art's fucking awesome, dude. So I'm excited to read more of it. This show, we talked to so many artists and writers, but we haven't gotten a lot of like artists, writers, and also like somebody who publishes and, does what we both do at this point. So instead of giving advice as to writers and artists, what advice would you give a publisher in your status?
Oh man, this one's a rough one, because I've still got so many goals. I've got a lot of goals that still feel like it would just be dipping my toe into the industry. I'll give an example of one place I'm still really trying to grow, and that's getting like national distribution and bumping up against how incredibly difficult it is to sort of adhere to the standards of Diamond and Lunar and any of the other like kind of big publishing houses. It's a huge risk to take on. So that part has been the nut that I haven't cracked yet, and it might just be a volume thing. I might just need to get enough pre-orders or interest that it would have to be like the next logical step as opposed to like a goal. But the biggest thing is just find comic book shops that are willing to carry indie books, and support the hell out of them. Drive an extra 45 minutes to an hour to go and support those shops, because the one thing that has sort of shocked and maybe saddened me a little bit is just how many comic book shops are like, maybe they just have limited real estate. Maybe they just don't want to deal with the hassle of, consignment or anything that doesn't come from the pallet and that they can report and notch back and send back onto the pallet. So those ones, I feel like if they die out, if comic shops that are local that are willing to carry indie books die out, then it's going to be a huge blow, just, nationwide, worldwide, to the entire industry. And the best way that you can foster that sort of relationship is just give the ones that do all your business. Even if you're just going to buy Marvel and DC, if you see that they're carrying indie books, local books, any of that stuff, like just bring them your money, please. That is the number one, because especially as a publisher, because you're just going to be helping inspire more people for them to carry more and more books, and let them know why too. Like, oh, I come to your shop because you carry indie books and other people don't. And maybe just start looking around. If you only read some of like the big fours or fives, ask the shop owners, hey, do you carry local books? Do you ever, do consignment type stuff? And if they don't, burn the freaking place down when they go on vacation. That's my suggestion.
Dude, I love it. Honestly, I admire our shop here in Winchester, Virginia, Four Color Fantasies. They are so supportive of indie creators and indie books since I've only lived here for about a year and a half now, and they've helped me in more ways than I can count. And I'm so lucky to be part of a city that does so much for indie creators, because it was very scarce in El Paso where I was. There wasn't a lot of, it was very just Marvel DC driven, Lunar, Diamond distribution. And so that's why, even making indie comics seemed impossible to me at that point, because you just don't see them around. And moving here and having the support of a shop, or a shop that would carry my book, and I, go into it months later after I sell it, and I see like, a copy on the shelf, and I'm like, dude, that's awesome that you're even asking for a restock, and you're doing all this, and you're wondering when our next release is, and that's a really great thing, and that's solid advice. We don't give enough of our comic book shop owners and businesses that carry our material, aside from Marvel and DC, we don't give them enough credit and credibility and attention, and that's solid fucking advice right there. The one time I get to cuss on the show, there you go. Dude, tell us what you're up to here in 2024. Let the audience know and where we could find you and where we could find your work.
So paranoidamerican.com is the one place that for sure won't be shadow banned. I hope. Double fingers crossed. You can find a lot of stuff on there. We have just did a really big campaign that was successful for Chaos Twins. That's a book that I did with Sam Tripoli. He's
so cool,
amazing comedian. Yeah, he's the coolest guy you ever meet. But it's called Chaos Twins, an all ages thing. And you mentioned it's got a lot of like cryptids in it. That's just the first issue. It kind of is like an all ages friendly version of as much as we can get into. Like the issue one's got reptilians, shapeshifters. Yeah. So that gives you an idea. And it's got Bigfoot, it's got Mothman. But I've also got a whole bunch of other projects. Some are a little more or less dicey. One's called Illuminati, Naughty, and this is like an adults only comic series that'll be out in 2024. And it basically I'll give one example. There's a rumor that Aleister Crowley might have had some relations with Barbara Bush's great grandma, Pauline Pierce. So we just explore if that were true, and they go through interested. A full like magic sex ritual and everything that perhaps results in the progeny of the Bush dynasty. So, and in full glory, like 18 plus goodness. And that's a 4-issue series that I already started getting printed up, some initial like early bird kind of backer stuff with Comix Wellspring. But 4 issues, a total of 8 stories. There's going to be 12 total. And another big one is Never a Straight Answer, and this one you can look at nasacomic.com, nasacomic.com, and this is about Stanley Kubrick directing the Apollo moon landings under the direction of the CIA, essentially. And it is like, for me, it's the ultimate love letter to all of Stanley Kubrick's movies that I loved, but it also has got every little inside conspiracy theory angle that I could muster to put into this thing. So anyone that's always talking about like Eyes Wide Shut being related to this surreal ball from the Rothschilds that Dali was on, it gets into that. It gets into like the specific 3M beads that they use for the backlit projection. Like it gets into the weeds so that anyone that has no idea what the conspiracies are, you might overlook it. You might still have a fun time with it. And anyone that knows every little detail, like you're going to be proud. You'll be like, I love this, I feel seen and heard. That's what you'll feel like if you know all the conspiracy theories.
Oh man, that all sounds so exciting. I'm looking forward to both of those right there. I'm a big Aleister Crowley fan, so I'm hyped. I'm genuinely curious about this. I gotta check it out. Thank you so much, man, for taking the time out of your day, joining us and talking about all this. I hope to get you back on the show soon. There seems to be a lot more to uncover, not only on your journey, but your creations and what you've gone through as a creator to get through this and get to this point in your career. So I can't wait to dive into more on that on a future episode. Thank you so much for just coming. And to our audience, as always, thanks for hanging. Keep making comics and stay inspired. Looking for high quality printing, fast turnaround, and the industry's best customer service? Look no further than Comics Wellspring. Trusted by thousands of indie comic creators, Comics Wellspring is proven to be the go to comic book printer. So when you're ready to bring your comic books to life, go to comicswellspring.com and be sure to check out one of the best platforms to sell your physical and digital comics online, the CWS Bookstore. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell to see our lives come out twice every single week on YouTube and podcast platforms. And also tag us when you share your favorite episodes and moments from the show. And remember, creators, thanks for hanging, keep creating, and stay inspired.